because there's a lot going on. Here we go, but it looks good. I'm just going to pull up the actual link and double check for viewers. Things are looking great. Okay, perfect. All right, so we are at 12:30 here in central Wisconsin. Well, in Wisconsin, I guess in the central time zone. I know we've got some viewers coming in from other states, so welcome to day 3 of Wisconsin Salt Awareness Week. So I'm Allison Madison. I am the program manager at Wisconsin Saltwise, and I'm really thrilled to have all of you joining us today for the live stream. We've got Dr. Allison Counture here from Madison, Wisconsin, who's going to be talking with you in just a moment about the issue of salt pollution showing up in our drinking water. Before she gets going, I do want to just take a moment to recognize some of our partners in the Wisconsin Saltwise Coalition. Saltwise is really a coalition of organizations from municipalities, governmental agencies, nonprofits. We work with school districts and private partners across the state. So today's special shout out goes to a few of our private partners, Casper's and Appleton, Reinders team, which is spread out, I know, across Wisconsin and even some of the other states, and Ninja De-icer. These 3 companies work in the field of winter maintenance and have really been committed in the last several years that I've known them to educating contractors and school districts and the municipalities that they work with on best practices. What materials are in the de-icers that they're using, what temperatures should those be used at, what rates are needed. So I just really want to commend the dedicated staff at those organizations who have continued to train the people that they work with, invite me in to do trainings, and just do participate in a lot of collaboration. So thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Counture. If you have any questions during her talk, you can type those questions into the chat and we'll take those at the end. If that doesn't work, just email me at wisaltwise@gmail.com. So, all right, Allison, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here and hopefully teaching a little bit about salt as it relates to health. Again, as Allison Madison said, I'm Dr. Allison Counture. I'm a family medicine doctor practicing in the Madison area, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Salty drinking water and human health. So a little bit of an outline of what we're going to get through today. We're going to start with salt and sodium recommendations, just to ground us in kind of what we're recommending from a health perspective and from an environmental perspective. Then learn a little bit about why we care, how our body's cells respond to sodium. Salt's impact on blood pressure and other organs. I'm sure this is not the first time anyone has heard about the impacts that salt can have on our health. So we'll talk a little bit about the why behind that. And then we'll talk about salt levels in drinking water and again, how that can relate to health. So we'll go back to Science 101 very briefly. Salt, sodium, we use them interchangeably. They are the same but different, right? So salt is the actual ionic compound that, is the white flaky crystals that are all in our jars, that are on the roads, and that's the actual sodium and chloride together, versus sodium, right, is going to be the actual molecule that is oftentimes, specifically in table salt, bonded with the chloride. And so at times I might be saying salt, and if we're saying salt, we're thinking about it in the sodium chloride ionic compound. But at other times we're thinking about it at the different individual kind of molecular level of the cation sodium and the anion chloride. And those in and of themselves can have different implications. But by far and large, these two very commonly go together. And so that is why it's super commonly kind of interchanged. So let's talk about the recommendations for salt and sodium in our diet. Who knew you're going to be getting quizzed today? We won't have it as an official poll, but just kind of silently take a look and cast your honest vote. Who knows what the FDA, Food and Drug Administration's recommended limit for daily sodium intake in adults is? Is it 1,200, 1,500, 1,800, 2,300, 3,400, or 5,200? So go ahead, take a guess, be honest with yourself, try to commit to something. What do you think is the recommended daily limit? And once you got that in mind, let's see how you did. So it is 2,300 milligrams is the recommended limit intake for adults in a day. Looking at these other numbers that I pulled from, the 1,200 is the recommended limit for the ages 1 through 3, and it's then it goes up to 1,500 for ages 4 to 8 years old, 1,800 milligrams for 9 to 13 years old, and then anyone 14 and above, inclusive of all adults, it's at 2,300 milligrams. The 3,400 milligrams is the actual average of what those 1 and older intake in the United States. So you can see we're almost a full gram on average above what the recommended daily intake is. And the 5,200 is kind of even the upper limits of when they're doing averages. They're seeing ranges as high as 5,200 and even 600 or 6,000, milligrams of sodium.
Allison, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Got a question that came in. Do you know how many milligrams are in a teaspoon of salt?
Oh, that couldn't have been a better segue for my next slide.
All right.
I have that right here. Seriously, perfectly timed. So there are then the sodium chloride milligrams, right? So when we talk about the sodium milligrams, in 1 teaspoon is 2,300 milligrams of sodium. So I'll say that again. 1 teaspoon of salt contains 2,300 milligrams of sodium, which is the recommended daily intake for adults. You can look here and you see then, a half teaspoon is half of that at 1,150 milligrams of sodium, all the way up to a full tablespoon of salt contains about 6,900 milligrams of sodium. Then you might also see the terminology of the weight of the salt. So that 1 teaspoon of salt that has 2,300 milligrams of sodium weighs about 5 grams. So you might sometimes see the nomenclature of 5 grams of salt, which contains 2.3 grams of sodium, right? Because again, there's that salt is the combination of sodium and chloride versus sodium is just that particular molecule itself. So hopefully that answers the question. If not, please make sure I clarify that again. And then we bump over to the average, right? In that prior question, we said the average is that we're generally intaking closer to about 3,400 milligrams of sodium in a day. So closer to a half tablespoon rather than the recommended 1 teaspoon. So moving on to how do our cells respond to sodium? The kind of most commonly widely known hypothesis and validated in research is that sodium entering the cells promotes water retention. But we also know that there are other factors or impacts that sodium can have beyond just kind of the water flow osmosis impacts. That is, it can have direct increases to blood flow resistance within the blood vessels. It can actually alter the lining of the cells of the arteries, which we call the endothelium. And it can over time change the structure and functionality of those large elastic arteries like our aorta. And we also have some novel research showing that it can impact nervous system activity as well. So focusing in a little bit on that water retention, I have both words and a picture for both audio and visual learners. So in the diagram, we have kind of our regular cell in the blue circle, and then outside of it in the white space, we have, it's labeled as salt. I would actually correct it to say those should be kind of individual sodium cations. So when we eat salt, it enters our digestive tract, which then enters into our bloodstream. The high sodium in the bloodstream causes water to draw out of the cells around it in a process called osmosis. This higher level of water outside of the cells then causes the blood volume in the bloodstream to swell, and that individual cell shrinks, which can increase the pressure in the blood vessels. Cells don't want to shrink, so in order to adapt from the middle picture to get back to kind of that homeostasis in the far right picture, the cells will quickly move that sodium around it into the cell to attract the water to come back into the cell. However, this is at the expense of now having an increased intracellular sodium concentration. So that's kind of that progression of the water retention. I just want to point out, this is, we have a very detailed picture that, tons of advanced research now has, delineates this process very, very nicely, but there is actually texts all the way back to the Warring States period in 475 BC, that's almost 2,500 years ago, that has written, the salty flavor moves to the blood. And in case of diseases of the blood, one must not consume salty flavor in large quantities. And additionally, later it says the correlate of the heart is the vessels, its rulers are the kidneys. Hence, if one consumes large quantities of salty food, then the vessels will congeal so that their flow is impeded and the complexion changes. So this is not a new problem, team. We've known about this for 2,500 years. We just describe it in more detail than what these authors of traditional Chinese medicine had back then. But it's kind of wonderful that we can trace this historically as well. So from there, the arterial alterations, again, I talked a little bit about how it can change the actual lining of the artery cell walls. And so this excessive sodium intake can cause the arteries to stiffen, because that higher intracellular sodium can cause processes that cause fibrosis, and that can lead to the stiffness that amplifies age-related vascular damage. So I have a picture, again, words plus picture for different learners here. So this is an example of the architecture specifically of a pulmonary artery, although a lot of this is extrapolable to all of the different arteries in our body. You have kind of the nice smooth muscles with the endothelial cells and the good space for blood flow. And then in the picture on the right, you actually see that increased muscle layer, increased fibrosis in the wall of the vessel, and that subsequent narrowing of the vessel, which is what induces then that increased vascular resistance and increased blood pressure, is how we ultimately clinically can perceive that. So what is salt's impact on blood pressure and other organs? Again, excessive sodium and salt can put you at risk for high blood pressure. That's one of the most kind of researched, proven pieces of information that we have. And we also have other studies that show that it can cause the heart muscles to enlarge. It can contribute to headaches, kidney disease, osteoporosis, which is loss of bone density. It can contribute to strokes, heart failure, developing kidney stones, and stomach cancer. The excessive levels of salt that can contribute to the increased water retention can also lead to the symptoms of puffiness, bloating, and weight gain. So here's my words followed by a picture, as you are probably noticing I do. I'm just going to play this video that has, I just think, a really nice representation with audio over it that I wanted to share with you all.
Why is too much salt bad for you? Eating too much salt can be bad for your blood pressure. Your kidneys help control your blood pressure by taking water out of your bloodstream. Salt contains sodium. Too much sodium in your blood pulls the water back in. More salt means more water in your blood vessels, and that means higher pressure. Over time, high blood pressure makes your blood vessels work harder. To cope, their walls thicken, reducing the space inside the blood vessels. Your blood pressure rises even more, and less blood may get to your organs. Blood carries oxygen and other nutrients around the body. Less blood to your heart can cause pain known as angina, or even a heart attack. Less blood to your brain can cause a stroke or a type of dementia. High blood pressure contributes to around half of heart attacks and strokes.
Okay, I'm going to pause it there and move on, because then it gets into, oops, there we go, a little bit more of UK specific recommendations, which are similar but slightly different from our US recommendations. So I don't want to confuse you all, so I'll just stop it there at kind of that background piece. So this is a meta-analysis, which is a type of study that takes multiple different studies and compiles all of their results together to be able to look at larger effect sizes. And how we represent it in this, a little bit busy slide is what's called a forest plot. And so it takes all of the results. And so each line here is a separate study that has looked at how the salt consumption can impact blood pressure in individuals with high blood pressure, as well as individuals without high blood pressure. And if you see these lines, it has a tick of kind of their average. And this middle line is kind of no effect at all. So if you move towards the right, if that tick is towards the right, it would say lower sodium can cause high blood pressure, versus if the tick moves to the left, that indicates lower sodium having lower blood pressure effects. And so you can see here, in both hypertensive individuals and normotensive individuals, so people with high blood pressure and with normal blood pressure, the effect sizes for both groups is that lower sodium results in lower blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, the effect of the lower sodium can have a greater impact on how much your blood pressure is lowered, versus in a normal blood pressured individual, we still see benefits. It's just not quite as much as someone who has high blood pressure. And the total mean reduction across these studies was 4.4 grams of salt per day, which again is about 2,000 milligrams of sodium. So if we're thinking about individuals on average consuming those higher amounts of sodium, over 1,000 or sometimes 2,000 milligrams over the recommendation, this study is looking at, when we shift it down by that margin, what impact can this have? And it can lower the systolic blood pressure, that top blood pressure number, by about 2.5 to 5 millimeters of mercury. What I don't show here, but is also present in this data study, is that it has similar impacts on the diastolic blood pressure, which is that lower number. So we think systolic blood pressure is that goal of 120, and the diastolic blood pressure is that goal of 80 or lower. And so this is just kind of bringing to fruition what the Chinese scholars 25,000 or 2,500 years ago, just in more numbers and data. So kind of building on that knowledge. You may have also heard the terms of salt sensitivity. So some individuals are more sensitive to the effects of sodium than others. And I liked this quote: "A phenomenon with remarkable variability among human subjects." And we are still trying to learn how to differentiate between those that are salt sensitive and those that aren't, because we don't have a quick and easy test that just says you are and you aren't, and you don't have to care and you have to care. Because there are multiple factors that go into salt sensitivity: genetics, hormones, neuroendocrine regulation. So I'm not going to say too much more on that, other than some are more susceptible or more sensitive to salt. But generally speaking, all humans are sensitive to salt. Some just have a greater effect if consuming it. I like to show this Nike swoosh because it shows a little bit of what we call kind of a J curve. So very crudely, if you move off to the right and we're saying that's the level of high salt versus the level of low salt, we also know that you can actually have worse outcomes if you have no salt in your diet. So this talk isn't meant to be, you should cut out all salt. Human cells, we need a homeostatic or a baseline level of salt. And when we go into low salt levels, we similarly see higher rates of bad outcomes. So we kind of want to just be in this middle ground and not be too extreme. So the summary of salt, you need it, but not too much. The hard part is kind of being able to figure out where you are in that middle piece. And so now I want to move a little bit on to salt levels in drinking water. So we know by far and large in the US, and worldwide, the majority of our salt and sodium intake comes from our diet. And this just kind of gives you a breakdown of the average kind of US diet, where the majority of that sodium is coming from. So sandwiches are one of the largest parts. Rice, pasta, grain dishes are another large part. And then you actually can see this other sources of 19%. And our drinking water is increasingly becoming a source of sodium. Certainly not to the levels of, an entire Jimmy John sandwich, but it is something that we're seeing over time. And because we have knowledge and data and ability to detect these things, we need to be aware of this. And so that's part of what this talk is today, is just kind of cultivating that awareness that salt can show up in our drinking water. There are no state or federal standards for sodium in drinking water. However, our Wisconsin Department of Health Services recommends a threshold of 20 milligrams of sodium per liter as a threshold for people who are following a low sodium or no salt diet. So if it exceeds that level, if your water supply exceeds that 20 milligrams per liter threshold, the Department of Health Services does actually recommend considering using bottled water for drinking. Bottled water can also carry sodium, so it's not always, an equal exchange. And the other piece is, well, how do I know how much water or how much salt is in my water? And that's where the amazing people at SaltWise come in. These are just two examples of what is 20 milligrams. And I'm so sorry, that's supposed to say milligrams of sodium, not 20 grams of sodium. Radishes do not have 20 milligrams of sodium or 20 grams of sodium. And a 3-ounce bag of raisin also has 20 milligrams of sodium. Excuse that typo. So it's not a crazy significant amount, but it is also something to be aware of. And so just that reminder here. This is a map that I was given by Allison Madison from data that they've retrieved of sodium levels in our public waters in Wisconsin. And off to the right, the darkest green are sodium milligrams per liter levels less than 10, and then increasing iterations upwards to the darkest red is greater than 101 milligrams of sodium per liter in the salt water. And so this is just kind of showing there are areas that are seeing, definitely higher levels than what our kind of Wisconsin Department of Health Services would recommend for those following low sodium diets or low salt diets. One well in La Crosse measured greater than 70 milligrams per liter. It was associated with a former de-icing salt pile that hadn't been covered in a timely fashion. And I'm sure, as you've heard already this week and will later in the week, a major source of salt in public water, sodium in public water, is from the road de-icing that is used. Because salt is a compound of sodium and chloride, this is chloride levels in surface water, so not what's coming out of your tap water, but like surface water in lakes and rivers. It's a little bit easier to measure, is my understanding. And so we get a lot of inferred data about sodium from monitoring chloride, as well as chloride itself can have negative impacts on the environment, plants, animals, infrastructure. It can corrode roads a little bit quicker. From a human cells perspective, chloride in and of itself is it's pretty hard to just get a isolated hyperchloremia or high chloride. Usually if that's happening, the salt's also imbalanced. So from a health perspective, we really don't fixate on chloride because in and of itself, it doesn't have much of a negative impact like salt does. And it typically follows what salt does. Sorry, cat just jumped up on my lap. We're just going to put her down for a minute. I thought I shut the door. She's sneaky. And so moving on. As I mentioned, causes of the increasing water salts, road salts, water softeners in homes, dust suppressants, fertilizer, can all have different salts, including potassium chloride salts that are going on. And the takeaway for me is, it's very difficult to remove salt once it gets into the water. It requires expensive treatment. Like my first question was like, well, I have a Brita filter. Like, can I just use that? And the answer is no. So that was learning for me in this process. You need products like reverse osmosis or ion exchangers to be able to do that. And that takes a lot of time and money. And so, a lot of this is working, especially in family medicine, in my mind, on the preventive side of things. Let's make sure that we're not doing things that increase the salt water if we can do other things to implement that, because it's hard to get rid of it once it's there. So looking at my time here, I want to save time for questions. Just kind of reviewing what we've talked about. We talked about the salt and sodium recommendations. We've talked about how our body's cells respond to sodium. We've looked at how salt can impact our blood pressure as well as other organs and disease processes. And then a little bit of the implications of rising salt levels in drinking water and kind of where it comes from and what to do about it will be upcoming in other lectures. So I will hopefully, I think I gave myself 4 minutes for questions. But if anyone has any, I can't actually see the chat. So Allison, I don't know if you're able to.
Yep, I can see the chat. Yeah, you're good. If you want to end this screen share, then you'll pop up a little bit bigger for people. And
thank you.
They're just a minute behind us. So if people want to start putting questions into the chat, you can do that now for Allison, and I'll be able to ask those. Yes, we have 2 Allisons here right now on screen for you. And 1 cat who I think just left.
Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And seriously, Allison, excellent job. Phenomenal. I loved it. Was not expecting to see ancient Chinese texts come out today. Thank you for a very enriching mini lecture. So we do have 1 question that's come in already. And Joseph has asked, can we get the citation for the meta-analysis that you shared on blood pressure?
Yep, I will. It was in the bottom corner, but it was probably so small to see. So let me, I can just copy paste that right now.
Yeah, and I think what we might do too, if you're up for it, Allison, is like sharing your slides as a PDF, and I can then kind of put those later on the webpage. But it looks like you were able to get that, let's see, in the chat for me. So I'm going to copy and paste that into the YouTube chat for Joseph.
Yeah. Perfect.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. And yeah, so we've got, we'll wait another minute here. Okay. So there was a question that just came in. What typical kids' foods have the most salt in them?
Yeah. So they are going to be a lot of kind of packaged foods in general. So, that's going to be crackers, right? That's going to be grains and like your breads are going to have a lot of high sodium. You're not going to see quite as much in like leafy green vegetables. You're not really going to see as much in fruit. It's there, but in small amounts, less than 10 milligrams for various things. Cereals are a really big factor for high salt in kids' food. So it really is packaged produced foods. It's even less so like the homemade. I rinsed my rice. That was always a learning piece when I was going through med school. Why do we recommend like rinsing your beans or rinsing your rice? We know that historically salt has been used as a great preservative because it, kills the bugs and bacteria around it. So from a public health perspective, that way it's great. And so everything's always kind of that double-edged piece or double-edged sword. But canned foods, rinsing those products, grains, kind of rinsing those products before use can slough off a little bit of that salt that's on them, and that's used as a preservative. And so those are just a couple things that you can do in those products. And then just, turn the label over and look at, what is the sodium level. It's always going to have that percentage of the daily recommendation. So if you're like, I can't, add up how many milligrams this all is, if it says this is 10%, that means, okay, 10 of these is going to get me to my total, right? And kind of thinking about it that way. So breads, grains, crackers, cereals are going to be really high sodium foods.
Thank you. Yeah, I like to make the connection for people that salt is able to be a preservative because it is toxic to those tiny little microbes, right? And that's good when we're trying to preserve our food. But if all that salt is ending up in our lakes and our streams, it's not good for the little critters there.
Yeah.
So thank you. We've got, let's see. Okay. Someone chimed in mac and cheese, very salty.
Yes.
Also we have thanks for a great webinar.
Yeah.
And then, Lance here has said he was quite surprised by the breakdown of salt in US diets. He sees pizza is high, but since French fries are our number one item, expected that to be much higher in the ranking. So I don't know if you have any comments on pizza, French fries. They're all salty.
Yeah, they're pretty comparable. I mean, you can make the argument one way, like if you look at McDonald's versus like your homemade, right? Generally speaking, homemade is always going to be a little bit less, both from a fries and pizza perspective. And anything produced is typically on average going to be higher for both of those. I couldn't comment specifically. There's too many of both of them to.
Yeah. And lots of averages here, right? When they're coming up with these figures for the average American average diet, right? So I do have a question, and this might be a little bit more of a conversation because it was eye-opening for me. I guess I didn't realize that the Department of Health Services, so this is a Wisconsin specific recommendation. If your drinking water is above 20 milligrams per liter, you should switch to bottled water. I guess my question / concern there is, how do you know how much sodium is in your bottled water? Because a lot of our bottled water, that's still coming from a water source somewhere that may have sodium in it, right? Or like,
I mean, a water bottle still has a nutrition label, and so it would say, so you would be able to look and see how much salt or sodium would be in a purchased water bottle. And the DHS's recommendation is specifically for individuals who have who are trying to follow a low sodium or low salt diet. So they are being, cautious about saying, this isn't something that we need to be doing for everyone.
The general population.
But it is something that if you are trying to follow a low salt diet, like you should have this awareness, and here's a potential modification to respond to that.
Because I guess my understanding, definitely from an environmental standpoint, I do not want to be pushing people to bottled water and all that plastic waste. But I guess I thought that municipalities had more stringent requirements for monitoring kind of what's in their water than sometimes even like the bottled water companies do. So I'm just very curious, like how frequently they're monitoring, like sodium concentrations. So something I want to dig into.
Please do.
So I will get back to people on that. No answers by Friday, but all right. So we've got another question here. Is MSG a big source of sodium?
Good question. I'm going to speak cautiously because I would have to look it up to be able to kind of confirm. The summaries is that a lot of the research into MSG has initially had a lot of hype and then has come down. MSG is monosodium glutamate or glutate. I can't quite remember.
I think it's glutamate.
Thank you. So there is sodium in it. And I would just have to check to see, what that level is. So again, if 1 teaspoon of that equals more than, sodium chloride is, or equivocal, then I would say it carries the same risks with that, versus if it's less, then it would be less. And I just don't know that off the top of my head. So I don't want to misspeak and misanswer, but I can look that up and send it to you, Allison, if that would be helpful to share out with the.
Okay. Yeah. And I mean, I can look into it. I would say just again, I don't have a ton of knowledge in here, but in terms of thinking about it, like chemically, like we talked about salt, sodium chloride, the sodium ion, the chloride ion, monosodium, one sodium, right? I'm assuming 1 sodium to a glutamate molecule.
Yeah.
And glutamate, I would think, is going to be bigger than just 1 chloride ion. Yes. So it's probably less sodium by weight than we'd be getting in salt. I guess, again, it's just a question of how much MSG are you consuming, right?
Right.
And that goes back to kind of your Nike swoosh, right? Of like small amounts of things, okay. It's when we get to that extreme, or maybe the extreme on both ends. Yeah. I want to be concerned. We've got another question though that's come in here about, let's see, I'll just read the question. Will drinking higher quantities of water, low sodium water, of course, lessen the effects of a high sodium diet? So can we dilute out that salt that we're drinking? Should we drink a lot of water if we're getting a good amount of salt in our diet?
That's a really good question. No is the kind of immediate answer, because the sodium cation is still going to have the effects in and of itself at a cellular level, and water is not going to behave the same as sodium at that level. And so we're constantly weighing that intracellular within the cell, as well as the extracellular, what's going on outside of the cell effects. And so, across that cell membrane, there's a lot happening. We know that salt and water, again, are very intricately tied. So interestingly, generally speaking, when you consume higher levels of sodium, because of the effects that it's having intracellularly, it's going to cue your body to want to increase its water amount, because it's trying to go through those kind of compensatory processes to reach a set of homeostasis. So oftentimes you do see higher levels of water consumption with higher levels of sodium consumption, because of the cues that your body's getting to get to that homeostasis impacts. And so oftentimes we're actually, especially for, severe heart disease, heart failure, liver diseases, we actually recommend both the sodium and water restriction for health, improving health outcomes. So we might say you have a 2,000 milligram sodium restriction, as well as the 2-liter water restriction, to kind of mitigate both of those things at the same time. So drinking above that would not result in improved outcomes, and sometimes can actually exacerbate outcomes.
Wow. Definitely not, that's not kind of where my brain went. So thank you, Allison.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think those are our questions for now. If more come in, I might, pass them along your way.
Please do.
But yeah, we can chat later and get your slides up if people want to share those. In addition, you can always continue to rewatch as well as share Allison's great webinar today with friends and others. This link will be good on our YouTube. We had someone just say thanks again with a smiley face. So
good.
Thank you so much for joining in and giving us this information. We do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.